The automatic doors of Ridgecrest Trauma Centre didn't open for the ambulance. They opened for a wall of black military vehicles that had no business being in downtown Kelowna, British Columbia, on a Tuesday morning. 3 Canadian Armed Forces Griffin helicopters dropped out of the overcast sky and planted themselves on the hospital's front lawn like they owned it. The rotor wash shattered the coffee a paramedic had been holding. Someone's car alarm started screaming and didn't stop. Inside on the 3rd floor supply corridor, Fiona Strand heard it before she felt it. A low thrum that climbed up through the linoleum into her boot soles. She stopped pushing her cart, tilted her head. She knew that frequency the way some people know, the smell of rain before it falls. Somewhere deep in the body, below conscious thought. She hadn't heard it in 4 years. She'd hoped she never would again. Fiona was 31, though the charge nurses who'd worked with her for 2 years would have guessed older. There was something in the set of her jaw, in the way her eyes moved across a room. Not restlessly, but with the careful economy of someone who had learned that looking away at the wrong moment had consequences. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight. Her uniform was always pressed. She spoke when she had something to say, and not otherwise, which, in the social ecosystem of Ridgecrest trauma, meant she was largely invisible. That was fine. Invisible suited her. What did not suit her was the cart she was pushing. Linen inventory. 4th Tuesday of the month. Fiona Strand, formerly Corporal Fiona Strand of the 1 Field Ambulance, Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps, veteran of 2 rotations in eastern Mali, and 1 classified deployment, she was not permitted to discuss at dinner tables or job interviews. Currently responsible for counting pillowcases on the 3rd floor of a civilian hospital in the interior of British Columbia. Dr. Philip Hastings had made sure of that. Hastings was the kind of man who filled a room with his own satisfaction. He was the chief of emergency medicine at Ridgecrest, 53 years old, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never been wrong in a way he couldn't explain away afterward. He had iron gray hair he kept deliberately longer than hospital policy, technically allowed, because the hospital board would never say anything to him about it. People didn't say things to Hastings. They nodded. They made notes. They found somewhere else to stand. He had transferred Fiona to supply management 6 months ago. It had happened the way these things happen, cleanly, with paperwork, with the language-based safety and scope of practice. A chest decompression she'd performed on a coding patient when no physician was in the bay. The patient had lived. The needle decompression had been textbook. Hastings had still written her up for practicing outside her lane, filed a formal complaint with the College of Nurses, and reassigned her to non-clinical duties pending review. The review had been ongoing for 6 months. Fiona had stopped asking about it. She pushed her cart. She counted pillowcases. On the floor above, charge nurse Beverly Okafor, the only person in the building who had ever treated Fiona like a colleague rather than a cautionary tale, had tried 3 times to have the reassignment reversed. Hastings had been pleasant about it in the way that was worse than being unpleasant. She's a liability, Bev. I'm protecting the hospital. What he was protecting was the version of the emergency department where Philip Hastings was the most competent person in the room. The thrum became a roar. Fiona left her cart in the hallway and walked to the window at the end of the corridor. 3 CH-146 Griffins sat on the front lawn, rotors still turning. Even from the 3rd floor, she could see the tactical configuration, not medevac markings. These were utility variants, the doors already open, personnel moving in a way that was not frantic but was absolutely not casual. Fast, economical, purposeful. A dozen soldiers fanned out in a loose perimeter. Another team was unloading a field litter with the kind of focused care that meant whoever was on it was still alive, but that the margin was thin. Walking beside the litter, radio handset pressed to his ear, boots eating the wet grass in long strides, was a man in a muddied combat uniform whose rank she couldn't read from this distance. But she could read the posture. She'd been around enough majors to know one by the way they moved through chaos. Not faster than everyone else, but smoother, like the chaos was weather and they were simply walking through it. She turned away from the window and was already at the stairwell before she'd consciously decided to move. The emergency department on the ground floor was a different world than the supply corridor. Hastings was already at the triage desk when the automatic doors failed. The power spike from the helicopter's ground support equipment had knocked out the door sensors, and two soldiers simply put their shoulders through the glass. Not violently, efficiently, the way you clear an obstacle when time is the only thing that matters. Cold October air poured through the opening, the smell of aviation fuel and wet earth. The soldiers moved into the ER with weapons slung, not raised. They weren't threatening anyone, but the presence of C8 carbines in a civilian trauma center had the effect of freezing every person in the room solid. Beverly Okafor, behind the nursing station, went very still. Two residents backed against the far wall. A paramedic who'd been finishing a handoff report simply stopped talking mid-sentence. Hastings did not freeze. That was the thing about Hastings. He had never in his professional life encountered a situation that made him feel small, and he was not going to start now. He stepped forward with the authority of a man who had once had a wing of this hospital named after his donor family. "I don't know what you think is happening here," Hastings said, loud enough for the room to hear. "But you have just walked armed soldiers into a civilian medical facility. This is a gross violation of..." The officer leading the detail stopped walking. He was a big man, somewhere in his mid-40s, with a face that looked like it had been left out in weather for a long time. His name tape read Bouchard. He had the eyes of someone who had stopped being surprised by other people's priorities years ago. "Major Bouchard, Canadian Armed Forces," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. "I have a critically wounded officer on that litter. Penetrating abdominal trauma, tension pneumothorax partially relieved in field, and a fragmentation wound in the left chest wall with a retained piece of unexploded submunition. We need a trauma bay cleared, type O blood on standby, and we need them now." The room absorbed this. Hastings absorbed it differently than everyone else. His face shifted through something that looked almost like calculation before settling back into authority. "An unexploded..." He stopped. Started again. "You brought a live explosive into my hospital. We brought a dying person into your hospital," Bouchard said. "The ordnance is encapsulated in field foam and stable. Our EOD team is 12 minutes behind us." 12 minutes, Hastings repeated. He looked at the litter being carried through the broken door frame, at the pale, still face of the person on it, at the complex arrangement of field dressings and improvised stabilization gear. He looked at his own hands. "My staff cannot operate around live munitions. I'm calling the bomb squad and the RCMP, and you will hold that patient in the..." "He will not survive a hold." Bouchard's voice dropped half a register. Captain Trent Ashby has approximately 8 minutes of viable pressure from the field chest seal before the cavity fills. The submunition is stable unless subjected to percussion. Standard surgery does not involve percussion. We are not asking your staff to touch it. Beverly Okafor was already moving. She had the kind of clinical instincts that bypass the part of the brain that waited for permission. Gloves on. She was calling out to a resident behind her, pointing at Bay 2, getting people moving. Hastings turned and looked at her with the expression he used when people did things he hadn't sanctioned. Okafor, stop. She stopped. 2 years of working under Hastings had trained her body to stop, even when her mind hadn't agreed yet. Nobody touches that patient, Hastings said, and there was something in his voice now that was less authority and more fear wearing authority's clothing. Not until I have legal counsel on the phone and the ordnance situation is. We didn't come here for you. The voice came from the stairwell door. It wasn't loud. It wasn't performing for the room. It was the voice of someone who had said important things in places where volume would get you killed, and the habit had never left. Fiona Strand stood at the bottom of the stairs. She still had a pillowcase folded over one arm. She'd forgotten she was holding it. Major Bouchard turned. He looked at her for 1 full second, at the supply uniform, at the ID badge clipped to her chest, at the pillowcase, and something shifted in his face. Not relief. Not yet. Something more careful than relief. Ridgecrest Trauma, he said. I need you to confirm. Corporal Fiona Strand, 1st Field Ambulance, deployed to Sector 7, Operation Precincts, January 2020. The emergency department had gone completely silent. Hastings turned slowly, like a man who wasn't sure he wanted to see what was behind him. Fiona didn't move from the bottom of the stairs. She set the pillowcase down on the bottom step, carefully, without looking at it. I haven't been a corporal in 4 years, she said. No, Bouchard agreed. You were medically released as a master corporal after the Onsongo incident. He paused. We know about your leg. Her left knee, the one the IED had taken apart in 4 places in a northern Mali ambush that had lasted 11 minutes and felt like a geological era. She'd had 3 surgeries. She walked without a noticeable limp now on good days, which today was. But the cold October air had settled into the joint the way it always did. And she'd been moving carefully all morning without letting herself think about why. I know about my leg too, she said. Something close to relief finally crossed Bouchard's face. Corporal, Captain Ashby, he was your patrol commander. Onsongo. The room ceased to exist for a moment. Trent Ashby. She hadn't said that name out loud in 4 years. She'd thought it approximately every day. He had carried her out of the ambush site on his back for 600 meters under fire with her leg in the state it was in. She had spent those 600 meters trying to maintain pressure on a wound in his shoulder with her one free hand. It was, objectively, one of the more remarkable things 2 people had ever done together. They didn't talk about it afterward. They didn't need to. She was across the room before she had a plan. The soldiers with the litter tracked her movement, and she tracked them, and it was the smoothest 10 feet she'd moved in years. Because her body remembered what it was doing, even when her brain was still catching up. Ashby. He was pale in the way that had a specific clinical name she didn't let herself use yet, because naming it made it a timeline. Mid-30s, lean. The kind of fit that came from still being operational rather than recreational. The field dressings on his chest were, she cataloged them in under 3 seconds. Left chest, lateral. The foam encapsulation around the lower wound was professional work, someone who knew what they were doing. The seal on the pneumothorax was holding, but the flutter valve was saturated and needed changing 10 minutes ago. She looked up at Bouchard. Who did the field stabilization? Surgeon Poirier, our medic. She's on the second bird. It's good work. The seal needs changing. Bay 2, let me. Jenkins, Hastings' voice, flat and absolute. She turned. Strand, she said, reflexively. Strand, he corrected himself without softening it. You do not have clinical privileges in this department. You are non-clinical staff pending a college review. If you touch that patient, you will be criminally liable for practicing medicine without. Dr. Hastings. Beverly Okafor stepped out from behind the nursing station. Her voice was very quiet and very steady. With respect. She is describing a flutter valve change on a chest seal. That is a first aid intervention. I will supervise it. You will do no such. The college review, Fiona said, still not raising her voice, covers clinical nursing interventions in the emergency department. It does not cover basic airway and breathing management in a pre-hospital context. She looked at Hastings with the kind of steadiness that came from having been looked at by people who were actively trying to kill her. I'm not asking for privileges. I'm asking for 2 minutes and a new flutter valve. Hastings looked at the room, at Bouchard, at the soldiers standing in his emergency department with weapons on their shoulders, at Beverly Okafor, who was looking at him with something in her expression that he had never seen there before and didn't like. He looked at the patient on the litter. Whatever Hastings was, he was not the kind of person who said out loud that he was afraid. So he found another thing to say instead. If anything goes wrong in there, this is on you. This entire situation is documented as. Bay 2, Fiona said to the soldiers. Go. They went. The next 4 minutes were the most honest 4 minutes. Ridgecrest Trauma Centre had seen in a long time. Beverly at Fiona's elbow, passing what she asked for before she finished asking. One of the residents, young, 3rd year, who had not yet learned to be more afraid of Hastings than of a dying patient, moved in without being asked and held retraction when Fiona needed it. Major Bouchard stood at the head of the bed and monitored the oxygen saturation with the focus of a man who had learned field medicine the hard way and never stopped. The flutter valve, the saturation coming back up slowly, the way good news always arrived, not all at once but incrementally, 1 number at a time. The retained submunition in the lower chest wall was encapsulated in specialized military field foam that had hardened to the consistency of firm rubber around the casing. It was not, Fiona noted, going anywhere. The foam had been applied with the geometry of someone who understood that the fuse mechanism was on the lower aspect and had protected accordingly. She did not touch it. She did not need to. She worked around it the way you worked around a sleeping thing, with a kind of focused respect that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with knowing exactly what you were dealing with. Ashby's blood pressure, which had been somewhere a clinician tries not to think about, began to move in the right direction. She became aware at some point that there were more people in the bay than there had been. She hadn't noticed them enter because she hadn't been watching the door. When she looked up, she saw that the doorway was crowded. Nurses, residents, a couple of attendings from internal medicine who had no clinical reason to be there. They were watching the way people watch something they don't entirely understand but can recognize as real. Hastings was at the back of the crowd. She couldn't read his face from this distance. She didn't try. The EOD team arrived at the 11-minute mark, which was 1 minute behind Bouchard's estimate, but within acceptable variance. Master Warrant Officer Clement, a compact woman in her 50s with EOD patches and the calm of someone who had been doing this long enough to have a sense of humor about it, took one look at the foam encapsulation, made a small approving sound, and got to work. She extracted the submunition in 6.5 minutes, using a tool kit that Fiona didn't recognize from any civilian context, and placed it in a containment vessel that 2 of her team members carried out through the back exit at a pace that was brisk without being alarming. "Good containment on the original packing," Clement said, pulling off her outer gloves. "Whoever did that on site saved about 3 rooms of this building." "Surgeon Poirier," Bouchard said. "Buy her a coffee." Clement glanced at Fiona, "And whatever you did in there, that was clean work." Fiona was already looking back at the monitor. Pressure stable. Saturation 94 and climbing. The resident, his name tag said Nakamura, was watching the numbers with the expression of someone committing them to memory. "He's going to need vascular surgery," Fiona said to Bouchard. "The lateral chest. There's damage to the intercostal bundle that the foam can't compensate for indefinitely. He needs a cardiac surgery center. Ottawa or Toronto." "We have transport laid on," Bouchard said. "HMCS Stadacona has a surgical team standing by. We can medevac him from the roof in 20 minutes. He paused. "If he's stable enough to move." "Another 30 minutes and he will be," Fiona said. Bouchard looked at her for a long moment. "I'd like you to accompany him." She looked up from the monitor. "As a civilian medical consultant," Bouchard said, "temporary contract. We have the authority to bring you on under National Defense Health Services provisions. Given your history with Captain Ashby and your—" he stopped, chose words more carefully. "Given your record, Corporal, we should have reached out a long time ago." The bay was quiet except for the monitor and the distant sound of the helicopters outside, rotors winding down now that there was no immediate need for speed. Fiona thought about the linen cart on the 3rd floor. She thought about the college review that had been ongoing for 6 months and had never once been intended to reach a conclusion. She thought about Hastings standing at the back of the crowd, watching. She thought about Trent Ashby carrying her 600 meters on his back in the dark in northern Mali without putting her down. 30 minutes, she said. "I need 30 minutes to stabilize him." "You have them," Bouchard said. She turned back to the patient. Behind her, she heard the crowd in the doorway shift and then part as Beverly Okafor walked through it toward the bay. Beverly set a fresh pair of gloves on the instrument tray without a word, pulled up a stool, and sat down to assist for however long it took. It took 26 minutes. When Fiona stripped off her gloves and walked out of Bay 2 into the main corridor, the emergency department was quieter than she had ever heard it. The soldiers were staged near the entrance, professional and patient. The broken glass from the doors had been swept to the sides by someone with a push broom. She didn't know who. The morning light through the damaged entrance was the flat gray of an October sky clearing after rain. Hastings was standing near the triage desk. He had the posture of a man who had been waiting and was not sure what he'd been waiting for. "Jenkins," he started. "Strand." It came out automatically and without heat. "You performed clinical interventions without privileges." He straightened slightly. "I will be filing. Dr. Hastings." Major Bouchard walked out of Bay 2 behind her. He stopped at her shoulder. "I'm going to need you to hold that thought." His voice had the patience of a man who had decided not to be angry because anger was less effective than clarity. Corporal Strand's interventions today will be documented under National Defense Health Services provisions as field medicine under military authority. The college review of her conduct in this department will be receiving a formal communication from the Judge Advocate General's office regarding the original incident that prompted it, specifically whether the chest decompression she performed, which saved a patient's life, constitutes a grounds for complaint, or whether the delay in physician response that necessitated it does. Hastings said nothing. The patient she intervened on 6 months ago, Bouchard continued, is alive. We spoke with him this morning as part of our background research when we located Corporal Strand. He filed his own statement with the college 3 weeks ago. He was not aware the review was still ongoing. A pause. He was under the impression it had concluded, in her favor. The nursing station had gone very still. Beverly Okafor, standing just inside the doorway, was looking at a point somewhere above Hastings's left shoulder with great intensity. The review, Hastings said finally, is a college matter, not a military one. You're right, Bouchard said pleasantly. Good luck with it. He turned to Fiona. She was already looking at the triage desk, at the supply request forms in the in-tray, at the schedule on the whiteboard that had her name on it 3 times this week under non-clinical inventory. She reached into her breast pocket and took out her Ridgecrest Trauma Centre Supply Department ID badge. She set it on the triage desk, not with drama, just with the particular deliberateness of someone who was done with a thing. Then she looked at Bouchard. Let me get my jacket. He nodded. She went to the staff locker room and came back in 2 minutes with a jacket that was, in the way of all things she owned, practical and unremarkable. As she crossed the ear toward the door, she passed the doorway of Bay 2, and through the glass she could see Nakamura checking Ashby's vitals with the careful focus of someone trying to do the job right. She paused for half a second. He looked up, saw her, and gave a small, earnest nod. She returned it. She passed Beverly at the nursing station. Beverly reached out and put a hand briefly on her forearm, just for a moment, just contact, and then let go. At the entrance, where the doors had been, the cold air came through clean and sharp and smelling like wet grass and turned leaves. October in the Okanagan. She had grown up 3 hours from here, in a town small enough that everybody knew the names of everyone else's dogs. She had joined the army at 19 because she wanted to do something that mattered, and the options in a town that size were limited. She had not expected to end up counting pillowcases in a hospital supply room at 31. She had not expected a lot of things. The Griffon on the lawn had its rotors spinning up again, slow at first, and then faster. The pitch of the engines, climbing toward that frequency, she felt in her chest rather than heard with her ears. 2 soldiers formed up on either side of her as she crossed the wet grass. Not an escort, just people moving in the same direction with the easy coordination of people who trained together. She climbed into the helicopter without looking back at the building. They lifted off at 9:47 in the morning, banking east and climbing through the low cloud cover until the Okanagan Valley opened out below them in autumn color. The vineyards gone gold and amber, the lake a flat pewter, the mountains holding their first snow at the tree line. She had forgotten how good the country looked from the air. She had forgotten a lot of things from up here. Beside her, on the secured litter, Captain Trent Ashby's saturation held steady at 96. His color was coming back in the way that meant The body was arguing for itself. He was sedated, had been since the ambush, and would not know until much later where he was or who had been there. That was fine, she knew. The helicopter leveled off and headed east, and the morning light came through the porthole window and caught the chrome of the medical equipment and turned it briefly gold. And Fiona Strand, who had counted pillowcases for 6 months and said nothing about it, looked out the window at the country she'd come from and let herself quietly breathe. There's a moment in Fiona's story that I keep coming back to. Not the surgery, not the helicopters. It's the pillowcase. The one she set down on the bottom step of the stairwell before she crossed the room. Carefully, without drama, like she was simply putting something aside that no longer needed carrying. That small, quiet gesture tells you everything about who she actually was, even when no one around her could see it. I think about what it cost her to show up every Tuesday and push that cart. To hear Hastings say her name with that particular brand of dismissal and just correct him calmly and keep moving. Most of us, if we're honest, would have either burned the place down or disappeared entirely. Fiona did neither. She stayed, and she stayed intact. And that is not a small thing. What strikes me about her is that she never stopped being competent just because someone decided to stop seeing it. The knowledge didn't leave. The instincts didn't leave. The 6 months in that supply room were real, and they were genuinely hard, but they didn't hollow her out. When the moment came, when Ashby's saturation was dropping, and Bouchard was standing there asking if she was who they'd come for, she didn't hesitate. She didn't need to rebuild herself from scratch. She'd been keeping herself whole the whole time. That's the part I find genuinely difficult to hold on to in my own life. The idea that doing the right thing, knowing your value, staying honest about what you're capable of, none of that guarantees anyone else will recognize it on any particular timeline. Hastings filed his paperwork. The college review dragged on, and Fiona counted linen. Cause and consequence don't always move at the speed we want them to. But they do move. What Bouchard said at the end, about the patient filing his own statement, about the JAG office, about the review heading toward a conclusion, Hastings hadn't planned for. None of that appeared from nowhere. It accumulated. Every choice Fiona made in that building, every time she was precise and quiet and right, was part of what made that morning possible. Beverly knew it. Nakamura figured it out quickly. The 2 soldiers who walked with Fiona across the lawn toward the helicopter weren't escorting her. They were just moving in the same direction, which is a different thing entirely, and the story earns that distinction. What I take from Fiona really is something about the relationship between integrity and recognition. She had one before she had the other, and she didn't treat the first as contingent on the second. That takes a particular kind of clear-headedness that I think gets underestimated, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like a woman pushing a cart. It looks like someone who accepted a bad situation. It looks, to someone like Hastings, like confirmation that she didn't matter. It wasn't any of those things. It was someone keeping their knowledge sharp, their judgment sound, and their sense of themselves intact, so that when the helicopters came, she was ready. Not because she'd been waiting for rescue, because she'd never stopped being the person who didn't need it.